Shalom, this is Rabbi Johnny Solomon, the virtual rabbi, and this is my online Chumash Rashi Shiur dedicated in memory of my dear friend Lenny Borgia, my Chumash Rashi Chavruta, Yehuda ben Shmuel, and as such this Shiur is Li'ilui Nishmato. This Shabbat we read Parashat VaEra, and in VaEra we read about the 7 plagues of the 10, of course, that was meted out to the Egyptians. In this Shiur we'll look at a number of psukim and Rashis and commentaries relating to some of those plagues and the events taking place before they were meted out onto the Egyptians and in between. Let's begin. We begin with the first verse of Parashat VaEra, and to understand this verse a little bit of context is needed. The last 2 psukim of Parashat Shemot involve a criticism of Moshe Rabbeinu to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, where he says, Lama hara'ot la'am hazeh? Why you've done harm? Why you've been bad to this people? The Israelites are still enslaved. HaKadosh Baruch Hu responds saying, just you see. Parashat VaEra continues with that response, and yet the wording in the pasuk is certainly of interest. The pasuk says, V'yedaber Elohim el Moshe v'yomer elav ani Hashem. And the Lord spoke to Moses, and he said to him, I am God. Now, in order to understand the complexity of this verse, it's important to distinguish between the words V'yedaber and V'yomer. V'yedaber means to speak. It's generally understood as being lashon kasha, speaking in a harsher tone. Whereas V'yomer is generally to say, and is generally understood to mean a softer way of communicating. Paralleling this, the name of God Elohim is generally understood to speak about God's midat hadin, his harsher form of justice, and how God is absolute in terms of his demands. Whereas Yud Kei Vav Kei Hashem is a name used to describe God's midat harachamim, his merciful dimension. In this verse we have something curious. V'yedaber Elohim, and the Lord spoke, El Moshe, to Moses, sounding very harsh, using the word V'yedaber and using the name Elohim. But it continues to say, V'yomer elav ani Hashem, and he says to him, I am God. What's this all about? Well, Rashi explains, V'yedaber Elohim el Moshe, diber oto mishpat al shiksha ledaber v'lomar lama erot ha'am hazeh. Rashi explains that God is speaking harshly at Moshe because Moshe basically was a little out of line in speaking harshly to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Moshe criticizes God. Lama hara'ot ha'am hazeh. These are words from chapter 5, verse 22, we saw at the end of Parashat Shemot. And now HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God continues to Moshe and speaks to him in a harsher tone. But of course, as we noted, only the first few words are harsh, V'yedaber and Elohim. Soon afterwards, we find the words V'yomer and Hashem. And in explaining this feature, let's turn to Rav Zalman Sorotzkin in his Oznaim LaTorah, because he says something really very majestic. V'yedaber, hitchil b'dibur kasha. HaKadosh Baruch Hu spoke initially with a harsher tone. Lo dio, to inform Moshe, shachat ba'amor, that Moshe had spoken improperly. He had sinned by saying the words Lama hare'ota. Moshe had spoken out of turn in an improper way to God. Aval rak rega bapo. But God was only momentarily angry. V'techef nitratze lo hamakom. Masar lo et dvarav b'lashon aviya raka. And immediately afterwards he accompanied the rest of the message with a gentler way of speaking. V'yomer elav ani Hashem. So the verse begins with a harsher tone, with a sudden almost word of warning and reprimand, but continues in a gentler way. And Rav Zalman Sorotzkin says this perhaps can be thought of based on the Gemara in Ta'anit Daf Yud Tet, where Rav Shimon ben Shatach says about Choni HaMa'agel, Ilmalei Choni ata gozrani alecha lindot. Were you not to have been Choni, I would have decreed on you to be in Cherem. Aval ma aseh lecha? What am I going to do with you? V'ata mitchatei lifnei hamakom. You sin before the Holy One, blessed be He, and you treat Him as a father, and He treats you with kindness like a son. כיוון מתחתל אביו. And continues Rabbi Sorotskin, אף את הגערה במשה התחיל וידבר אלוהים אל משה. Here too, this critique of Moshe begins with its harsher words, וידבר אלוהים אל משה. לאמור, אלמלא משה אתה ראוי היה. As if to say, were you not to be Moshe, you would really be in trouble with me. שמידת הדין תדבר איתך קשות. Because מידת הדין would say, you've been out of line. אבל מכיוון שמשה אתה, but because you are Moshe, ויאמר עליו אני השם. God speaks to him gently. Through this insight, we learn an important lesson about rebuke, which means that even if somebody steps out of line, even if one has to use harsh tones, maybe do so for the first word or two, but then switch it, to demonstrate your love of them. Rebuke without love is pointless. Here Kadosh Baruch Hu says, Moshe, I don't like being spoken to the way you spoke to me. He says that in the opening words of the Pasuk, but that he affirms his love of Moshe in the continuing words as well. That is the Oznaim LaTorah of Rav Zalman Sorotskin on the opening Pasuk of Parsha VaEra. Let's move on. And we move on by focusing on a Pasuk later on in Perek Vav. Here we've been told about the leaders of the Levi'im. And who are the major leaders of the Levi'im? Moshe and Aaron. Hu Aaron and Moshe asher amar Hashem lahem hotziu et bnei Yisrael me'eret Mitzrayim al tzivotam. This is Aaron and Moshe, to whom the Lord said, take the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt with their legions. On this, says Rashi, something very interesting. Hu Aaron and Moshe, elu shehuzku lemala. These are those who had already been previously alluded to in the Psukim earlier on. Shiad Yocheved Amram, who were born to Yocheved and Amram. Hu Aaron and Moshe. This is Aaron and Moshe. Yesh makomot shmakdim Aaron and Moshe. And continues Rashi, there are some situations, there's some place in the Torah where Aaron is mentioned first in a verse and then Moshe is mentioned. Yesh makomot shmakdim Moshe la'Aaron, and there's some verses where Moshe is mentioned first. Lomar lecha sheshkulim ke'echad, to teach us that they are equal. So that's a lovely idea. Moshe and Aaron are equal. But asks the Geresh Carmel, really? Is that really the case? He says, V'im tamar ha'emet hu shemoshe gadol me'Aaron. Surely the truth is, we all know Moshe was greater. V'yesh lomar be'enei ha'olam haya Moshe gadol me'Aaron. And the fact is, yes, in the eyes of the people, Moshe was greater. Aval lefi datam, but between the two of them, hayu shkulim ke'echad. They were equivalent. Moshe honored his elder brother, who was older by 3 years. And Aaron showed greater respect for Moshe because Moshe was the greater of the two prophets. What we see from this simple and yet important insight is sometimes from the outside you think you understand the dynamic between two people. But on the inside, it may well be very different. On the outside, Moshe may have been greater, but between them, they were mamash shkulim. That is what the Geresh Carmel says. But I want to share with you a really exquisite insight by Rav Moshe Feinstein in Kol Ram. Here he quotes Rashi. He says the same question, really. V'kasher ha sof kol sof haya Moshe yoter gadol me'Aaron. At the end of the day, Moshe was greater. And he goes on to mention Moshe as being the most prominent of prophets who spoke to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, panim el panim, right? Face to face. And now he shares with us a really important insight that we all should certainly take to heart. V'yesh lomar da'af agav Moshe ben haya yoter gadol me'Aaron. Even though Moshe was greater than Aaron objectively in terms of his spiritual qualifications, at least if you merely focus on their capabilities as a Navi, as a prophet. Mikol makom, says Rav Moshe Feinstein, nevertheless, hayushkulim b'ma shekol echad avad et Hashem v'chol kishronotav v'kochotav shayu lo. They were equivalent in terms of the fact that both used their unique skills to serve God to the maximum. And he continues, הנה כל אחד נולד עם כישרונות וכוחות, ואין בזה כל מעלה, כי זו מתנת שמיים. אבל כל אחד צריך לעבור ולשפר את עצמו. He says, God gives each of us unique gifts. And we can't claim mine is better because each has been afforded by God. But it's up to us how we use the gifts we have. לראות שקיימת התורה והמצוות בכל כוחותיו, זה כל תפקידו בעולם. That we maximize the gifts we've been given, the capabilities we have, that's our mission on earth. And that's the point, according to Rav Moshe Feinstein, that Rashi wishes to emphasize. True, on one measure, Moshe was higher. But Moshe and Aaron, both of them used the skills that they had to the fullest. And that made them shkulim. He continues with a beautiful explanation of Gemara and Baba Batra, and a further explanation which I invite you to have a look at. Let's now move on, though, to our next pasuk. And our next pasuk tells us about Makat Tzfardea, the plague of frogs. We've got Dam Tzfardea, it's the second plague. V'yet Aaron al yado al meimei Mitzrayim v'talat Tzfardea v'tachas et eret Mitzrayim. We know, and Rashi himself mentions, how the first few plagues were performed by Aaron rather than Moshe, out of Hakarat Tatov. The water saved Moshe, the Tzfardea from the water, and the sand to which where he hid the Mitzri. And so Aaron is performing the first few plagues. But then Rashi tells us an interesting chazal, Tzfardea achat haita. It says, Ha-Tzfardea, the frog, not Tzfardeim, frogs. What do we do with this? Well, you could say that Ha-Tzfardea or Tzfardea is just the word we use both for individual frogs and many frogs. But there is a tradition that there was one Tzfardea, one frog, Tzfardea achat haita, vayumakin ota v'hi matazet nichilim v'zeh midrasho. This medrash tells us that there was one frog, and they hit it, and it multiplied and it multiplied. In many ways, the Mitzrim caused the plague unto themselves. And many years ago, I heard a very interesting application of this medrash in terms of public policy. It was an idea shared by my Rebbe, Dain Gershon Lopyan, quoting from Rav Yitzchak of Volozhin. And here we are told the following: Hagon Itzlam of Volozhin, min hagayashi kol talmid lipared mimenu. It was his custom that whenever a student was leaving the yeshiva, he'd give him life advice, each according to what they need. And in terms of one particular piece of advice, this is what he said. הדרך להיאבק נגד הכיתות והתנועות החדשות, כמו ישראל בדורות האחרונים, אסור לה שתהיה בדרך של תגרה ומלחמה גלויה. He says, in his time and even in our time, different groups and denominations often arise, to which we often have ideological disagreements. The question is, what do you do with that? Says Rav Yitzchak of Volozhin, don't make it into a public fight. כי עצם התנצחות הפומבית והתגרות המוגזמת מביאה להתחזקות יותר של הצד כנגד. Basically, if you fight them, they will multiply. And he says, what's my raya? What's my proof? This Rashi. אוסיף על כך רב יצחק אסמך מן התורה, רש"י מביא על המקרא ותל צפרדע, כי צפרדע אחת הייתה, היו מכים אותה, והיא מתזת נחילים. מה היה קורה אם עליה היו מתקרים בצפרדע מכים אותה? מאומה. What would have happened had they not done that? Nothing. אותה צפרדע הייתה נותרת בודדה. That singular frog would have remained a single frog. Sometimes how we respond to certain trends and innovations or movement or ideologies either gives it more the further fuel for the fire, or in fact limits its further growth. It's up to us in terms of how we use our words when we oppose things, because sometimes, even if you fundamentally oppose things, when you go out to war at it, in fact you are strengthening it. Let's move on to our final pasuk. It comes towards the end of Parsha VaEra, we've had the plague of hail, and hail has been coming down, and Paro begs Moshe, okay, just please stop it. Moshe says, okay, I'm going to stop it. ויאמר אליו משה קצאתי את העיר אפוס כפיי אל השם הקולות יחדלון בברד לא יהיה עוד למען תדע כי השם הארץ. Moshe says, okay, I'm going to go leave the city, I'm going to pray to God, and the plague will end. Asks Rashi, why do you have to leave the city? He didn't daven in the city, because the city was filled with idols. Now, that may well make some sense, but asks Baruch Halevi Epstein in his Tosefet Bracha, but didn't Moshe pray until now? And we don't have evidence he left the city each time. How come we only learn about him leaving the city to pray in this plague? And here he explains the following. Pirush Rashi shelo ratzah litpalel be'ir mipnei shayta mele'a avodat zara. V'lo nitpalel lo menzal nitorar al yitziat davka b'ma kazu. Why are we only encountering this behavior with this makkah? And he explains something both very simple and I think telling. We know that the Egyptians worshipped the sheep, right? And we know that this is already clear because Moshe Rabbeinu says, maybe we should slaughter them. Now, what happens in the plague of hail? Well, until now, the sheep are in the fields outside of the cities. In the plague of hail, the Mitzrim bring their sheep whom they worship into their homes, into their cities. And once that happens, says Baruch Halevi Epstein, then the city becomes maleh im ililim, it becomes filled with what they consider to be idols, and it becomes a place where it's improper for Moshe Rabbeinu to pray. As it says here, with this plague, Makat Barad asher rabim hinisu et miknehem el habatim asher ba'ir k'mufurish b'pasuk chaf hayot davar Hashem ma'avdei parah v'hinis et miknehu el habatim im ken hayta ha'ir mle'a avodah zarah. As a result of this, the city was filled with what they considered to be idols. Lechen amar katzeti et ha'ir. This is why Moshe tells Paro, I'm going to leave the city to do my davening. And it's just for our final source worthwhile pointing out, the Chumash from Sedeshen that talks about this in terms of what happens when we are confronted with a situation. Where is it best to pray? He says, Sheila mishu baderech vayom ma'ariv v'ed litfilat mincha v'karov lemalon le'ir shekula nachrim shuchal lagia sham ba'od hayom gadol shapir shamtin litpalel ad ki yavo lemalon o yipalel b'sadeh gam ken me'umad gon shuchal istarek min haderech. Where is better to daven? When a person's on a journey or when they're in an inn or hotel, but unfortunately that could be a place where there are improper things or idols, and the Chumash Sedeshen quotes this Chazal and makes it clear that if where you're going to daven is to be spiritually compromised, better to pray as long as you're safe where you are on the journey. And this teaches us an important lesson. Where we daven is really an important expression of the focus we have of how we daven. That's why Chazal emphasized having a makom tefillah, or ideally a makom kavua tefillah. But if that's not possible, at the very least, be sensitive to the things around you so you can remain focused, not just in terms of intellectually, but spiritually as well. And know that sometimes there are places which are simply improper to daven in, and that's what we learn from Moshe Rabbeinu. I hope these are a number of useful insights that can be beneficial to you. Perhaps share at the Shabbos table. I wish you all Shabbat Shalom.